Hey there, it is Saturday, so it's movie night, and I'm here to present another quadruple feature for your viewing pleasure. I have not done one of these videos in quite a while. At the beginning of the pandemic, I did them every week for 40 weeks, and right now I believe this is week 78. So I've gone almost as long without doing a single quadruple feature video as I did at the beginning of the pandemic, which is kind of a bummer because, I had a lot planned that I wanted to do, a lot of movies that I wanted to talk about with you and recommend. In fact, I had planned up to 2 years worth. So I have a ton of quadruple feature ideas that never came to light. And I wanted to keep doing them, but after I released the very last one I did, week 40, there was one more week left in 2020. So I had a quadruple feature plan for that week. But the next day, my dog got sick, Pepper, my sweet little dog. And it didn't seem like a very big deal, but we took her to the vet. But then she had to go to the animal hospital, and she had to have an ultrasound and all of these tests done on her. And she had to stay in the hospital for a night and then another night. And then she had to have an emergency surgery to remove her gallbladder. And she just kept getting sicker and sicker. And she was in the hospital for an entire week. And it was really emotionally devastating. And, it was really expensive. It wound up costing like $17,000. And we wound up losing her anyway. She died, and we were devastated, and it sort of took the wind out of my sails for these quadruple feature videos. I just couldn't muster up any shits to give about movies or really anything, and I certainly couldn't stand in front of a camera and talk about movies. So I just kind of stopped doing them for a really long time. I stopped doing anything, and I stopped talking to my friends and family. I was really depressed and sad after losing Pepper. And the last quadruple feature that I had planned for 2020, the topic was death. And so I certainly wasn't going to be doing that one. I still watched the quadruple feature. I was still having the quadruple features for myself and sometimes for Gina. And I still watched those. In fact, my 4 death movies were the last 4 movies that I watched in 2020. So that probably sounds a little bleak and depressing, but when I was thinking about 2020 at the time and kind of looking back on the tumultuous year it had been, I was thinking in the future, when we look back on 2020, the longest lasting legacy of that is certainly going to be the amount of people that we lost, the amount of friends and family and neighbors that died from COVID, because there was like a fucking shitload. And how could death not be the legacy of 2020? So that was what I was ending the last quadruple feature of the year with. I ultimately didn't do that quadruple feature. But yeah, I watched all 4 of those movies because sometimes I think, even when you're sad, watching sad movies or movies that deal with grief or death or whatever, I think that could be a good thing. I think it can be beneficial to kind of sit with your thoughts and face these scary, sad things that you don't like facing. And I felt like I kind of owed it to myself to just watch some really fucking sad movies at the end of the year and just kind of reflect on everything that was going on in my head. And if you want to do that, I'm going to recommend those 4 movies now, like 8 months later. I actually have 2 quadruple features planned right now. I'm going to recommend 2 different quadruple features, so I'll talk about the second one in a moment. But the movies that I want to recommend for a quadruple feature on death, I think, are 4 of the best movies ever made on the topic of death and dying and grieving, which there are a lot of movies made about that, and there are a lot of them that don't necessarily ring true, especially American films. There's not a lot of American films that really dive into grief that well. So there's only one American movie, and the rest of the movies are kind of from all around the world. The first movie is a Swedish film, and as you've guessed from me recommending Bergman films 6 or 7 times in these quadruple features already, It's an Ingmar Bergman film, and it's my favorite movie of his. It's Cries and Whispers, which I think is actually the best movie to ever deal with death. It's about a group of sisters, and one of them is dying. She has sort of like cancer, and it's how the family kind of reacts to that and deals with it and tries to push it away and tries to hide from it. And it's a very harrowing film, but it's really powerful and very beautiful as well. He uses the color red very lavishly in the film, which might strike you as a bit theatrical in the production design, but I think it's a really beautiful use of color, a very powerful use as well. But it's a really harrowing film, but strongly recommend sitting through Cries and Whispers at least once. You know, I think there's a lot of similarities between this film and The Exorcist. They both came out the same year. They were both nominated for Best Picture that year, and they're both about a small family really dealing with something very trying and difficult. So like one young woman from the family is cooped up in a bedroom dealing with a demon possession or dealing with dying of cancer, and the rest of the family just kind of has to react to that and go about trying to live their lives as best they can, while also kind of trying to deal with this horrible thing taking place in a bedroom of their house. But that's neither here nor there. We're not watching The Exorcist tonight, even though I really love it. But Cries and Whispers, masterpiece by Ingmar Bergman. Movie number 2 is the American film that I have on this list. Now, I think most people kind of think Ordinary People is maybe the best American film to deal with grief and death. And I think that one is very good, but there's one that really just knocked me out when I saw it. Kenneth Lonergan's Manchester by the Sea, I think is a really powerful film. It really takes its time kind of lulling you into the story and getting you to know these characters, and you find out who died and who's alive and what these relationships are with these people. And then when it hits you with the melodrama, it hits it on an almost operatic level. I think it's an incredibly powerful movie. I think it uses kind of classical music very effectively, and I love the use of the unironic use of classical music, which you don't see very often. But I think it's a really powerful film, kind of about family and family dynamics and death and dying. But a great movie on grief. Michael Haneke has a few filmmaking devices that he uses in all of his movies. He uses very long takes with a static camera shot, just like watching someone or something happen without moving the camera very much or at all, and just kind of lets the scene play out. He does that in all of his movies. He also doesn't use a score in any of his movies. Sometimes the effect can be very unsettling and scary, like in Funny Games, but sometimes it can just kind of make something feel all the more real and more of like a gut punch when you're watching it, because it's almost like you're watching your own parents or your own grandparents, which is the case for Amour, which is about an old couple. The wife she has Alzheimer's. She's at the beginning of the stages of having Alzheimer's, and she does not want that, and she does not want to live a life where she gradually forgets everything and changes who she is. Like, that's not the life she wants. He does not want to lose his wife, and he doesn't want her to change either, but the most important thing to him is like maintaining his relationship with his wife. So how do you reconcile that when you have two diametrically opposed views for what you want to happen? It's really a beautiful movie. It's very sad, it's a little frightening, and it's just a testament to what some people who really, really love each other will go through for the other person. Very powerful. One really great movie about death. And another one of my favorites, Japanese film from Akira Kurosawa. It's Ikuru. And this is about a guy who works sort of like a shitty bureaucratic job, just kind of passing the buck, taking forms and sending someone else to the next window, kind of soul-sucking, lifeless job. And he hasn't really made any changes in the world. He hasn't really left his mark in any capacity. And then he finds out one day that he's dying and he doesn't have very long to live. And the first half of the movie is him reconciling with that. I've kind of wasted my life. How can I make a difference? And then he decides, I am going to make a difference. I'm going to do one really great thing in my life. And so he's kind of trying to figure out what that is. And then he, figures it out. And he, I'm not going to like give you all the ins and outs of it, but it's a really beautiful story. And then the second half is his funeral. And it's all of his coworkers at the funeral talking about him and talking about how his accomplishment wouldn't have happened without this person agreeing on the paperwork, or this person filing that permit with the city, or this person doing that, or this person doing that. So it's everyone sort of trying to take credit for his accomplishment, and they have a very long, complicated conversation, and they all have to kind of realize what life means to each of them. It's a really powerful movie. It's a really brilliant film. And it's one of my favorite movies about death. So those are the 4 that I recommend for the quadruple feature on death. Those are my last 4 movies of 2020. Bergman's masterpiece, Cries and Whispers. Kenneth Lonergan's Manchester by the Sea. Michael Haneke's Amor. Kurosawa's Ikuru. I have another quadruple feature as well that I'd like to recommend. So today's September 11th. And it's been 20 years since the attack on the World Trade Center. And it's been a fucking crazy 20 years. I still remember that day so vividly. My mom woke me up for school, and she woke me up, she turned the lights on, and she said, "Wake up. An airplane has crashed into the World Trade Center. You have to come out here and watch the news." So I went out and I watched the news, and I got a glass of orange juice, and I finished drinking it, and through the bottom of the orange juice stained glass, looking at the TV, I saw the second plane hit the second tower. And I kept getting ready for school and, popping back out and checking the news and kind of trying to understand what was going on. I was in high school. I was not a particularly bright kid. I knew nothing about foreign affairs. And we lived with my brother's girlfriend at the time and her baby. My brother was in prison, so me and my mom and my dad kind of helped raise this kid, Dylan, for his first few years. And his mom would kind of pop in and out of his life. And she was there that morning. And I remember taking a shower, getting out of the shower, and her being like, "Oh my God, Paul! They bombed the White House!" She meant Pentagon. But it was a very confusing day, and then I went to school kind of wondering how my teachers were going to be discussing this topic. And in my morning class, we had sort of like kid news, like a video we would watch. And Maria Menounos, who's like an entertainment host now, as she's notable, she was like a kid who like hosted our news program. And I was like, I wonder, I think it was called Channel 1 News. And so I was like, I wonder what Channel 1 News is going to say about this attack. And then Channel 1 News started, and it was like, "Hey kids, let's talk about this brand new car. It's the coolest car on the block," or some shit, right? And the whole program went on and they never brought it up. So it's like, well, obviously these kids aren't doing like live news. It's like a pre-recorded thing, but it was baffling to me that they even decided to play it for us. But the day went on, and it was really weird, and watching high school kids kind of deal with this news was very uncomfortable, because a lot of the ways you see people dealing with it when you're very young is like making really, really crass jokes. And I still remember in my in like a science class, this teacher was talking about like force and mass and like hitting something, and a kid in class like says, "Yeah, like those people jumping out of the World Trade Center hitting the pavement," and then starts doing impressions like, "Whoa, whoa," and like kids are laughing at it, but he was just a total vile asshole. Maybe he still is, but he probably just didn't really know how to react. High school kids are callous and cruel and don't really give a shit about other people. But I found that pretty terrifying. In my last class of the day was speech practice. And I was sitting in a little practice room with two of my best friends, Brad King and Ryan Wantija, and we were just kind of talking about the day and what it meant and what we were going to do. And, there were already rumblings of like, we're going to go to war and there's going to be a draft and we're going to fucking get drafted. And so I was like, well, shit, I have really bad asthma. They're not going to draft me. And Ryan, was like, oh, I have an inability to gain muscle mass on my legs or some shit like that. They're not going to draft me. And then we were like, Brad, you better fucking come up with something. But we were really nervous. We were really freaked out and scared. And things have kind of continually gotten worse for the past 20 years. But just a couple weeks ago, Biden pulled our troops out of Afghanistan, officially ending that war that's been going on 20 years that started on this day 20 years ago. I don't know. I don't have a lot to contribute aside from the fact that I think the topic of death and September 11th fit together pretty nicely because, the thing we kept hearing throughout the pandemic was like, oh, this day we surpassed more deaths than September 11th. And that was a common refrain that we heard every day for months, it seemed. In fact, September 9th, 2021, we lost more people from COVID 2 days ago than we did in September 11th. So the fact that we're 20 years later, we're still looking back on September 11th and dissecting it with documentaries and movies and trying to figure shit out is an indicator that we're not going to be able to kind of like look back on this whole COVID debacle for decades with a clear head and kind of trying to decipher everything that has kind of led to where we are and the massive amount of deaths that we've had. But I don't know. I don't have much more to say about it except that I'm just thoroughly disheartened at the state of the world. We have vaccines and half the country isn't taking them. We know that social distancing and wearing masks has positive results, yet people still refuse to do that. And I can't really talk about that anymore. But I do have 4 movies that I want to recommend here on the 20th anniversary of September 11th. And the movies aren't specifically about September 11th necessarily. Like there are plenty of movies like United 93. We actually watched that on another quadruple feature, which I think is a brilliant film, but we're not going to watch things directly about that day exactly. So we're not going to watch like World Trade Center or Fahrenheit 9/11 or anything like that, even though I think there's a lot of quality things to be found in several of those films. We're going to be looking at films that dealt with it kind of on the periphery. They used imagery that was reminiscent of September 11th, or it was kind of casually mentioned. But I think it's basically just how Hollywood was kind of trying to process some of these feelings without being crass or without directly referencing it, because maybe we weren't ready as a society quite yet to look September 11th head on. And you know what? I think that's actually very accurate because, we were all inundated with that imagery when it happened, an image of the Twin Towers blowing up and collapsing and the big plumes of smoke and people getting covered in dust. And I didn't seek that imagery out. It was on the news or whatever. I didn't watch anything extra on YouTube, or I didn't seek it out online. And so those first few years, you would kind of see that imagery a lot, and then you kind of don't see it as frequently anymore. And I've just been watching this documentary series on Netflix, Turning Point, about September 11th and the wars that it caused. And man, those first 2 episodes all about September 11th and what was going on. And there's so much footage I hadn't seen before. I didn't realize kind of how much, I don't want to use the word trauma, but like how many emotions I had pent up about that day. Because on September 11th, I didn't like cry, or I don't think I really cried too much about it those first few years. But like, man, watching those first 2 episodes, which are all about that day and the aftermath, I was just kind of continuously crying through the whole episodes. I mean, just like watching those images unfold, with all of those people that were there. It's just, fuck, man. It hit me hard, So I think for the first few years, we weren't quite ready to head on deal with September 11th in a movie necessarily, but there are some movies that kind of dealt with it in their own ways. So those are the movies that we're going to kind of be looking at. They span about a 10-year period that I think we started kind of tenderly examining September 11th to when we're just kind of about a decade later, just head on fully examining it unemotionally. So the first one came out in 2002, and I believe is the first mainstream movie that really talked about September 11th. It's a Spike Lee joint, 25th Hour, and it's about a drug dealer who's about to go to prison. And I haven't read the novel that it's based on, but I would imagine this movie, the book, couldn't have had anything to do with September 11th unless the book was just like written and then a movie was immediately made about it. So September 11th, Spike Lee makes a majority of his films in New York. I think it was just like, well, I have to touch on this. And I really like the way that they approach September 11th in this film, because it takes place in the days after, and they just kind of like touch on it. You mention it here and there. You see a little bit in the background, but it's not about the day. It's not about, New Yorkers trying to survive or anything like that. It's just kind of like a fact of life that they talk about. When we make movies about COVID in the future, which we inevitably will, hundreds, I'm sure, I would appreciate if it's dealt with in the same way, because I don't need to watch a movie about the pandemic that we've been in for, going on 2 years at this point. But I would like to see a movie that's a normal movie about life, and it's kind of maybe casually mentioned, or we just kind of know about it, so when we see someone with a mask on, it's not strange or whatever. I don't really know. I don't know what I'm saying, but the way that they kind of, September 11th is kind of on the periphery of this film, I think it's actually really beautifully done. And I remember seeing it in theaters when I was in high school and thinking that Spike Lee handled it so elegantly and gracefully and respectfully to put it into the movie that really has nothing to do with it, but in a very classy way. The movie itself is fantastic as well. Stars Edward Norton, the late, great Philip Seymour Hoffman is in it, and he's incredible. I think it's one of Spike Lee's strongest films. Our next movie came out 2004, I believe. And again, this one's not about September 11th at all, but there is a scene in it that is, I think, really strongly symbolizes New York in a way that I think a lot of film goers needed. But it's Spider-Man 2, Sam Raimi's comic book masterpiece, and for my money still the greatest comic book movie ever made. There's a scene where Spider-Man is trying to stop a runaway subway train, and the pressure of having his webs kind of with the train on his back, pushing him forward, he stops the train and it makes him pass out. And, he averted catastrophe for all these people on this train. And then they lift him up and then they pass him back so that he doesn't fall. And it's just a really beautiful moment that is like a level of just poetic beauty that you just typically don't see in films like that. And I remember watching that in theaters and thinking that even though September 11th had been a couple years on at that point, it was just such a cathartic moment for me. I didn't live in New York, but just all of those people kind of coming together right after a very near catastrophe to make sure that Spider-Man was okay. It was just a really powerful moment. Spider-Man, he lives in New York. A lot of comic book characters live in their own fictional city, like Gotham City or Metropolis or whatever. But Spider-Man lives in New York, and there was, when the first Spider-Man movie came out, there was a trailer that got pulled. I remember seeing the trailer, and it's Spider-Man makes a big web in between the World Trade Center, and then I think a few weeks or a couple months later, the World Trade Centers came down and they pulled those ads from the airways. And then Spider-Man doesn't really have too much imagery reminiscent of the event, but I feel like Spider-Man 2, it just really kind of emotionally draws us into kind of a September 11th mindset very effectively. In 2005, there was a movie, again, these movies aren't specifically about September 11th, but something about them I felt was kind of cathartically working its way out through Hollywood. This is how we were dealing with it for a few years. And then there was one, it was the first movie I can think of after September 11th, actually set on an airplane. It's made by the master of horror, brilliant filmmaker, one of my favorites, Wes Craven's Red Eye. Terrorism was a very touchy subject, obviously, at the time, and action scenes on airplanes weren't something we were seeing a lot of at the moment, and we were just all scared about airports in general. You know, I remember the first time I flew after September 11th, I flew to a speech tournament, the Harvard Speech Tournament, and I flew with my speech team, and I was really grateful to be with like my friends and teammates in that moment, because I was pretty scared to travel. You know, I think we all were for a while, because the times I had traveled before that, it was like I'd get home from the airport, my flight would land, and like my mom or dad would be like at the gate waiting for me, and then that never happened again. That was done, you know. So it changed, and we started getting to the airport a couple hours early, and anyway, Red Eye stars Cillian Murphy and Rachel McAdams. It's a thriller from Wes Craven. The advertising campaign I thought was really brilliant, because the whole trailer's cut together like a rom-com. They meet in an airport and blah blah blah, and then, you know, they're sitting next to each other on the plane, and then he gives her like kind of a really fucking evil look, and then like the trailer kind of ends, and it was like, what the hell is that? And yeah, I mean, I think this one again is not directly referencing September 11th, but that was definitely on our minds when we went and saw this in 2005. There were other films in the years after that really drew on kind of September 11th imagery. Something like Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds of 2005 as well, which I considered being one of the movies tonight, but obviously went with Red Eye instead. You know, Tom Cruise is like covered in dust, people like exploding into dust. There's like that kind of imagery. And then Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, which was in, I think, 2013, kind of used those big plumes of smoke from like exploding buildings, as well as like Lawrence Fishburne is trying to save like a girl from the rubble or some shit, and then he's all like ash covered, which is, you know, very specifically drawing on our memory of that day. I feel like people covered in soot and ashes is like one of the most kind of memorable images that there is. People walking around like in a daze. You saw hundreds of them, and then eventually we start making movies kind of directly about September 11th, talking about it directly. United 93, World Trade Center, and then in 2012 is our last movie, and in this one, you know, it deals directly with some of the repercussions of September 11th. But I feel like Zero Dark 30 is a really good film by Catherine Bigelow. But this really signified the end of our delicate views about September 11th, because these first movies were kind of really gentle reminders of some things that happened, but that humanity is essentially good. And, you know, America was banding together, and united we stand and divided we fall, and the country was in agreement that we should go to war and fucking all this shit. When it was kumbaya, we were banding together to vanquish an enemy. And by 2012, Zero Dark 30 comes out, and there are some scenes of American soldiers being rough with some of the prisoners that they have, to try to get information about where Osama bin Laden is hiding. And the movie got a lot of backlash because of that, because, you know, Guantanamo Bay was kind of a blight on America's reputation at that point. Soldiers had been doing really shameful things and taking embarrassing pictures, and that this movie kind of showed that in a very frank light. A lot of people kind of turned on the movie, which is sort of funny, because Catherine Bigelow had won Best Director, first woman to ever win Best Director for The Hurt Locker a few years previous. And then she makes a very kind of similar themed movie about similar events, but now it's just like, hey, that's wrong, that's fucked up, we're not looking at this through our rose-colored glasses anymore. You know, America was back to normal by 2012 of just like, hey, fuck you, you can't make that movie, you can't show this, that, frankly, we don't like you. And then she didn't get nominated for Best Director, but I mean, I think she should have. But Zero Dark 30 is about the hunting of Osama bin Laden, and it's a very strong military film, and I think it's really good. And to me, this really signifies the end of like September 11th movies. Of course, there's still documentaries, and there's still going to be movies made about it. But I feel like there was about a decade-long period where the evolution of how we portrayed the events from that day and the fallout from that day kind of changed. And I think these four kind of signify that change. So the four movies we're watching for September 11th: Spike Lee's 25th Hour, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2, Wes Craven's Red Eye, and Catherine Bigelow's Zero Dark 30. So there it is. I don't know how I usually wrap these things up. Thanks for watching. I probably won't see you next week. I don't know. I just felt compelled to do a couple of these quadruple features after so long. But yeah, 20 years. I don't know. Take care. Get vaccinated. Wear a mask.